As the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, a young Canadian captain realized the most terrifying moment of the entire war had arrived, not the landing on Juno Beach, not the slog through the Scheldt, but the morning after victory. Captain Elias Harper stood in the shattered heart of Lindenberg, a small market town in northwest Germany that had once been home to 12,000 people. Now it was a graveyard of broken brick and twisted steel. The spring air carried the sharp bite of cordite mixed with the sweeter, heavier scent of charred wood and something Harper still couldn't bring himself to name. His boots crunched over glass and plaster as he walked the main street, where shop fronts gaped like missing teeth. 3 years earlier, Harper had been a 25-year-old history teacher in a one-room schoolhouse on the prairies of Saskatchewan, grading essays about ancient Rome and the fall of empires. Now, at 28, he commanded 130 exhausted infantrymen of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, men who had survived the worst the war could throw at them, only to be handed the impossible task of governing 16,000 Germans, the original 12,000 residents plus 4,000 refugees who had staggered in from the east, hollow-eyed and carrying everything they still owned. The orders from higher command arrived that morning on paper so stiff and clean it felt like an insult. Establish military control. Prevent resistance. Enforce strict non-fraternization. Treat all Germans as potential threats. The words were simple, the intent clear: keep them down, keep them separate, keep them watched. But the reality on the ground mocked every sentence. Harper carried the numbers in his pocket like a wound: 8 million Germans homeless across the country, 3.5 million dwellings reduced to rubble, daily rations in some places dipping below 800 calories. The Canadian Army alone guarded over 300,000 prisoners of war, many held in open fields behind barbed wire and little else. In Lindenberg, his 130 soldiers were stretched so thin that patrols consisted of 12 men covering streets that had once been patrolled by a single constable. They were tired. They wanted to go home. And now they were expected to feed, shelter, and control a population that outnumbered them more than 100 to 1. The British sector to the west was already coming apart. Reports described riots over bread, black market gangs that had learned just enough broken English to cheat the occupiers, bread lines that turned violent when supplies ran short. In Hamburg, 300 British troops struggled to maintain order over a population that outnumbered them 50 to 1, and still had to call in reinforcements when the lines broke. The Americans in the South were drowning in paperwork, their administrators arriving with typewriters but no understanding of local water systems or power grids, while children died of dysentery in the streets. Harper's own men were shadows in olive drab. Private Leclerc hadn't written a letter home in weeks. Sergeant O'Malley slept with his rifle like a child clings to a blanket. They had survived Juno Beach, the Falaise Pocket, the Scheldt Estuary. They had earned the right to go home. Instead, they stood guard over a starving population, and somehow that felt heavier than any firefight. Then they found General Karl Reinhard. The farmhouse stood at the end of a muddy lane, half hidden by overgrown hedges. Reinhard was waiting in the doorway when the patrol arrived, uniform still pressed, hands visible, no weapon in sight. 54 years old, 32 years in the Wehrmacht, former commander of an infantry division that had fought from Poland to the Rhine. He didn't run. He didn't beg. He simply extended his Luger butt first and said, in careful, accented English, "The war is over, Captain. I will not make it more difficult." Behind him stood the widow who owned the farm, twisting her apron until her knuckles turned white. She expected punishment for sheltering an enemy officer. But Reinhard had already written a statement, penned on the back of an old requisition form, in precise, elegant handwriting. It absolved her completely. He had requisitioned the house by military necessity, she had no choice. It was the first act of human decency Harper had seen from any German officer. His lieutenant wanted to ship Reinhard off immediately, standard procedure, process, delouse, interrogate, file away in a camp. But as they walked the general through the town, Harper noticed something that stopped him cold. The locals didn't shrink away. The former deputy mayor straightened his spine for the first time in weeks. The police chief, now disarmed but still wearing his uniform, offered a small nod that bordered on respect. These weren't reactions to a captured enemy. These were people recognizing authority when everything else had collapsed. Harper knew the history too well. After 1918, the Allies had imposed the Treaty of Versailles, stripped Germany of territory and dignity, and planted the seeds that grew into Hitler. Now they stood on the verge of repeating the same mistake. Treat every German as a latent Nazi. Control everything. Trust no one. It was clean policy on paper. In the mud and rubble of Lindenberg, it felt like madness. He did the math again. 16,000 people needing food, water, shelter, security. 130 soldiers who spoke no German, didn't know where the water pumps were buried, had no idea which warehouses still held grain. They could shout orders in English all day long, but who would actually do the work? Reinhard watched him thinking. "Captain," he said quietly, "your army won the war. But you have not yet won the peace. That requires different weapons." The idea came fully formed before Harper could stop it. Every regulation screamed no. His superiors would crucify him. But standing there amid the wreckage, watching German civilians haul water in buckets while his own men stood guard with rifles, Harper wondered if maybe the rules themselves were the problem. He led Reinhard to the half-ruined town hall, a brick shell with no roof, wind whistling through broken windows. Through a young private who usually translated ration forms rather than military proposals, Harper made the offer. Reinhard would act as liaison, coordinating the remaining German officials to restore basic services under Canadian supervision. In exchange, he would remain in Lindenberg under guard, not sent to a prisoner camp. It was collaboration with the enemy. Technically treason. But it might just work. Reinhard didn't laugh. Didn't argue. He simply asked one question: "Do you have the authority for this, Captain?" Harper admitted he probably didn't. The general nodded slowly, as if weighing the odds of two careers ending in the same moment. "Then we are both taking the same risk." "Very well. I will help, if only to prove that not every German soldier forgot how to serve honorably." They began at first light. Reinhard convened the first meeting in a basement lit by a single lantern. 2 Canadian soldiers stood guard, understanding nothing but watching every face. Within hours, he had located a warehouse the Allies had missed, shelves of canned vegetables, sacks of flour, even medical supplies stamped with faded swastikas. By noon, work crews were clearing the main road. By evening, water flowed from repaired pumps for the first time in weeks. Harper stood in the hospital as the lights flickered on. A German nurse began to cry, not from fear, but from sheer relief. An elderly patient reached toward the ceiling bulb as if touching something sacred. In that moment, Harper understood, every hour without power had been suffering he couldn't measure. And Reinhard had restored it in less than 24 hours. The results kept coming. Black market activity dropped by half when Reinhard quietly identified the ringleaders. He had been watching them for years. The local police, disarmed but still in uniform, began patrolling again under Canadian supervision. They knew the town, knew the troublemakers, knew which cellars hid contraband. Harper's men could focus on oversight while Germans handled the daily details. Then the jeep arrived. Colonel Hargrove from division headquarters stepped out with a face like thunder, clutching orders typed on official paper. "Cease all fraternization immediately." The general was to be transported to a standard POW camp. The arrangement violated every regulation about dealing with captured enemy officers. A formal investigation would determine if Harper had exceeded his authority. Hargrove looked around the functioning town, German workers rebuilding under Canadian supervision, the general coordinating with civilian officials, and his expression said everything. This looked like collaboration with the enemy. Harper tried to explain. 0 Canadian casualties. Food distribution working smoothly. 18,000 people being fed with no riots. Hospital treating 200 patients every day. All utilities operational. He needed only 15 soldiers now for ongoing supervision instead of the original 130. The rest could be reassigned to other duties. Hargrove wasn't impressed. Results didn't matter if the methods violated policy. Orders were orders. For 72 hours, Harper believed his military career was over. His men would be scattered. The fragile system they had built would collapse. The town would slide back into chaos, and he would face disciplinary action for doing something that actually worked. He spent those 3 days documenting everything, detailed reports on food distribution, utilities restoration, crime statistics, troop deployment ratios. He interviewed his soldiers, recorded testimonies from German officials, photographed the functioning town square. If they were going to shut him down, he wanted proof that his method worked. Reinhard noticed the frantic activity. "Is this the end?" he asked through the interpreter. Harper admitted he didn't know. "Then we make these 3 days count for something," the general said. They worked harder than ever, knowing each accomplishment might be their last together. And somewhere in those frantic hours, Harper realized something profound. The real victory wasn't defeating the German army. It was proving that even after the worst war in history, trust could still exist between former enemies. The question was whether anyone else would be brave enough to believe it. 3 days after Colonel Hargrove's furious departure, a different jeep rolled into Lindenberg's town square. This one carried Brigadier General Malcolm Thorne, a pragmatic veteran who had spent the war solving impossible logistical nightmares from Sicily to the Rhine. Thorne wasn't there to shout orders or enforce blind policy. He had heard the whispers about Harper's experiment through the chain of command, and before signing off on a court-martial, he wanted to see it with his own eyes. Thorne spent 2 full days walking the streets. He talked to Harper's soldiers first, privately, no officers present. He found men who were rested, who joked instead of staring blankly into the distance, who spoke of patrols that no longer felt like walking through a minefield of resentment. Private Leclerc told him about the first night the hospital lights came back on. "The German doctor shook my hand, through the interpreter, of course, but he cried like a baby. I've never seen gratitude like that." Sergeant O'Malley admitted the men were sleeping better, eating better, because they weren't trying to do everything alone anymore. Thorne observed Reinhard in action. The general moved through the basement command room with quiet authority, coordinating work crews that repaired bridges, cleared rubble from schoolyards, and distributed food from the rediscovered warehouses. 2 Canadian guards stood at the door, rifles slung, but they weren't tense. They watched, noted names, times, visitors, but the atmosphere was businesslike, not conspiratorial. Thorne spoke to a few German civilians through an interpreter. An elderly woman, her hands rough from years of farm work, told him in halting English, "For the first time since the bombs fell, I sleep without fear of tomorrow." A former shopkeeper added, "The Canadian captain sees us as people who made mistakes, not monsters who must be crushed forever." Then Thorne drove to the neighboring British-controlled town of similar size, 20 miles west. There he found 320 troops struggling to enforce martial law. Daily incidents, arguments over rations turning into scuffles, black market traders operating openly because no one knew the local players, exhausted soldiers pulling double shifts just to keep the curfew. The contrast was stark, impossible to ignore. Thorne did the math himself. If Harper's model could be scaled, thousands of Allied troops could be freed for demobilization or redeployment. The Canadian sector could cover more ground with fewer men and far less violence. It was a career-risking calculation, but Thorne had never been one to hide behind regulations when lives and stability hung in the balance. He filed his report that night, a detailed recommendation for an official trial exception to the non-fraternization policy in Lindenberg. He vouched personally for Harper's judgment, argued that field pragmatism should sometimes outweigh headquarters doctrine, and attached photographs of functioning utilities, orderly food lines, and children playing in cleared streets. "This is not collaboration," he wrote. "This is occupation done intelligently." The response from higher command took 3 weeks, 3 weeks during which Harper and Reinhard continued their work, not knowing if tomorrow would bring handcuffs or continuation. They pushed harder, as if each day might be the last. More warehouses inventoried. More roads opened. The hospital now performed surgeries under steady electric light instead of flickering candles. Crime reports dropped steadily. And something subtler began to happen, small moments of human connection across the divide. A Canadian private shared a cigarette with a German worker during a break, nothing spoken, just a nod and a light. A soldier helped an old man carry a bucket of water up a flight of stairs. Reinhard, ever formal, began greeting Harper's men with a slight bow when they passed in the halls. No warmth, no friendship, but acknowledgement. Mutual respect born of shared exhaustion and a common enemy, chaos. When the reply finally arrived, it was cautious but clear: the experiment could continue on a strict trial basis. Results would be monitored weekly. Any sign of German resistance, sabotage, or abuse of the arrangement would end it immediately. No fanfare, no medals, just permission to keep going. Harper read the message twice, then walked to the basement where Reinhard was meeting with the town's engineers about reinforcing the river bridge before the summer rains. He waited until the meeting broke, then handed the general the translated summary. Reinhard scanned it, nodded once, and said simply, "Then we have more work to do." Within days, word began to spread quietly through the Canadian First Army. Officers from nearby towns visited Lyndonburg, some skeptical, some desperate. They walked the streets, asked questions, watched German work crews rebuild under light supervision. They saw Canadian soldiers who looked like soldiers again, not jailers. They heard the numbers: rations reaching every household, no riots, black market activity down 70%, utilities at 80% capacity after just 6 weeks. They left wondering if they were doing it all wrong. By late May and into June 1945, the first copies appeared. In 7 neighboring towns, Canadian commanders identified their own reliable German officials, former mayors who had never joined the party, police chiefs who had quietly sabotaged Nazi orders, engineers who knew the infrastructure better than anyone. They set up similar liaison systems, always with tight oversight, Canadian guards at meetings, daily reports, veto power on every decision. Not every attempt worked perfectly. In one town, a lieutenant trusted too quickly and discovered his administrator had hidden SS ties. The man was arrested the same day, by his own former colleagues, who reported him because they feared the whole arrangement collapsing. Critics seized on the failure as proof the model was dangerous. Harper's response, when it reached him through channels, was calm: "Bad men exist in every system. The difference is whether your system catches them. Ours did, because the Germans themselves turned him in. They trusted us to protect them. That's the point." Most towns found the balance. They learned from Lyndonburg's early lessons: start small, verify everything, empower but never abdicate control. By July, the approach, now quietly called the Canadian method among officers, covered nearly 2 million German civilians in the northern sector. The Canadian occupation zone showed the lowest incident rates, the fastest restoration of basic services, and the least need for reinforcements among all Allied areas. Food convoys rolled in without escorts. Children returned to makeshift schools. Power lines hummed steadily. And in Lyndonburg's town square, for the first time since the surrender, church bells rang on a Sunday morning, not in celebration of victory, but in quiet gratitude for survival. Harper stood on the steps of the half-rebuilt town hall, watching German families walk home after services, Canadian soldiers nodding politely as they passed. He thought about the history books he used to teach from, how empires rose and fell on the choices made in the aftermath of war. And he wondered how many more towns could be saved if more people were willing to risk trust over suspicion. The real test, he knew, was just beginning. By midsummer 1945, what had started as one desperate captain's gamble in a single ruined town had quietly become something larger, a spreading experiment that no one in high command had officially approved, yet no one could ignore. Word traveled through the Canadian First Army the way good news does in wartime, slowly at first, then all at once. Officers from distant sectors made the pilgrimage to Lyndonburg. They arrived skeptical, notebooks in hand, expecting to find hidden sabotage or secret Nazi plotting. Instead they found orderly food distribution lines, children kicking a patch soccer ball in streets cleared of rubble, power lines humming, and, most astonishingly, Canadian soldiers who looked like men who might actually survive the occupation intact. The numbers began to speak for themselves. In the Canadian zone, where the method had taken root in more than 40 towns by August, civilian rations reached 1,200 calories per day on average, still meager, but consistent. Riots? Almost non-existent. Black market activity? Down by 70 to 80% in most places, because the German administrators knew exactly who the operators were and, under Canadian oversight, had every incentive to shut them down. Utilities restoration averaged 6 weeks faster than in comparable British or American sectors. And troop requirements. The Canadians needed roughly 1 soldier for every 1,200 civilians under the new model, compared to 1 for every 200 to 300 in the rigid control zones. The contrast was brutal. In the British sector, where direct rule still held sway, daily incident reports filled pages, fights over potatoes, thefts from supply trucks, exhausted patrols that sometimes fired warning shots into crowds. The Americans, meanwhile, struggled with mountains of paperwork and cultural misunderstandings. Their administrators often treated every German clerk as a potential war criminal, paralyzing local decision-making. Soviet zones operated on an entirely different principle, total takeover, but even their efficiency came at a cost measured in resentment and quiet resistance. The Canadian approach wasn't perfect. Failures happened, and they were ugly when they did. In the town of Greifenberg, east of Lindenberg, a young lieutenant named Davies had moved too quickly. He appointed a smooth-talking former municipal official to coordinate reconstruction, only to discover 3 weeks later, through a tip from a terrified shopkeeper, that the man had been a mid-level Gestapo officer who had hidden his past behind a desk job. The administrator had used his new position to intimidate witnesses and quietly threaten families who might expose him. When Canadian investigators arrived, they found a small cache of hidden weapons and a list of names marked for future attention. The scandal reached division headquarters within hours. Critics pounced. "See? This is what happens when you trust Nazis." Calls for a complete shutdown of the trial program grew louder. Political officers in Ottawa began receiving cables questioning whether Canadian troops were going soft on the defeated enemy. Harper, when the report reached him, responded with the same calm he had used since the beginning: "Every system produces bad men. The question is whether it detects and removes them." In Greifenberg, the Germans themselves reported him, because they feared losing the fragile stability we were building together. That's not weakness. That's the system working exactly as intended. The incident became a teaching moment instead of a death sentence. Canadian commanders tightened vetting procedures. Background checks now included interviews with at least 3 independent local witnesses, cross-referenced against captured Nazi Party records. Suspicious appointments required division-level approval. The model didn't collapse, it evolved. By September 1945, the Canadian method managed nearly 2.3 million civilians across 89 towns and 7 small cities. 12,000 Canadian troops oversaw an area that would have required more than 80,000 under traditional occupation doctrine. The savings in manpower were so dramatic that some units began rotating home earlier than planned. Morale climbed. And something deeper began to happen. Germans started protecting the system themselves. In several towns, former Wehrmacht officers quietly reported suspected werewolf partisans, die-hard Nazi loyalists who had gone underground, planning sabotage and assassinations. The reports came not from fear of Canadian reprisal, but from a growing realization that continued resistance would destroy the fragile peace they had begun to rebuild. One police chief in a northern district handed over a hidden radio transmitter and the names of 3 men planning to bomb a food convoy. "We want our children to eat," he told the interpreter. "We want the bombs to stop falling. Forever." Denazification, the Allies' highest priority, actually moved faster in the Canadian zones. Germans policed themselves more effectively than outsiders ever could. They knew who had been enthusiastic Nazis and who had merely survived. They turned in the dangerous ideologues while quietly protecting the apolitical technicians needed to keep water flowing and lights on. Intelligence officers discovered they learned more in casual conversations over coffee than they ever extracted through harsh interrogations. Yet the success bred powerful enemies. American military government officials lodged formal protests. They argued that allowing any former German officer authority, even under strict supervision, risked reviving Nazi influence. British political advisers warned of dangerous precedent. Newspapers in London and New York ran stories questioning whether Canadian troops were coddling the defeated enemy. One headline asked, "Are the liberators of Europe now the protectors of Nazis?" Harper began receiving anonymous letters, some praising his innovation, others calling him a traitor who would pay for his naivety. Someone scrawled "collaborator" on the wall of Lindenberg's town hall in the dead of night. The threats came from outside the town, never from within. The people under his care had too much to lose: steady food, working hospitals, children who could play without fear. Political pressure mounted on Ottawa. Cables arrived asking pointed questions. Was this sustainable? Was it safe? Was it Canadian policy, or just one man's dangerous improvisation? Through it all, Harper kept working. He watched Reinhard train younger Canadian officers on how to identify reliable German partners, how to maintain oversight without strangling initiative, how to build trust while never lowering vigilance. The general remained formal, distant, never smiling. But once, late at night, Harper overheard him tell a German engineer, "We lost the war. Now we must win the peace, even if our conquerors show us the way." It was the closest thing to hope Harper had ever heard from any German. The real test, he knew, was no longer whether Lindenberg could survive. It was whether the rest of the world would allow an idea born in rubble to grow into something permanent. Whether suspicion would win, or whether trust, carefully guarded, rigorously verified, might prove stronger than any army. And somewhere in Ottawa, in London, in Washington, the first serious staff studies of the Canadian method began to circulate on classified desks. The experiment had outgrown one town. It was becoming policy. Whether by accident or design, the peace was starting to look very different from the war that had preceded it.
By the autumn of 1945, the Canadian method had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer just an experiment in a handful of towns, it had become the quiet operating principle for an entire occupation zone. And the most surprising development wasn't the speed of Reconstruction or the drop in incidents. It was who began defending the system most fiercely: the Germans themselves. In town after town, ordinary people, shopkeepers, farmers, former clerks, even some who had worn uniforms during the war, started acting as the first line of defense against chaos. They weren't doing it out of love for the Canadians. They did it because they had tasted what happened when authority collapsed completely, and they had no desire to taste it again. In the small city of Osnabrück, a former Wehrmacht major who had surrendered his division in April quietly approached the Canadian liaison officer one evening. He handed over a folded piece of paper containing the names and last known locations of 4 men he believed were planning to sabotage the main railway bridge, the same bridge that now carried the food trains feeding 80,000 people. "These are not soldiers anymore," he said through the interpreter. "They are ghosts who refuse to die. If they succeed, we all starve. Again." The Canadians verified the information overnight. The 4 men were arrested at dawn by a mixed team of Canadian MPs and local German police who had been quietly rearmed for exactly this purpose. No shots fired. No riots. The bridge remained standing. And the major who turned them in never asked for special treatment. He simply returned to his work crew the next morning. Similar stories multiplied across the zone. A police sergeant in a rural district discovered a hidden cache of explosives intended for a market square on Saturday morning, market day, when crowds would be thickest. He reported it immediately, not to protect the occupiers, but because his own daughter sold vegetables there every weekend. "I fought for Germany," he told the Canadian captain later. "Now I fight for my family. There is no difference." These weren't isolated acts of heroism. They were symptoms of something deeper, a growing recognition that continued resistance would destroy the fragile normalcy people had begun to rebuild. Former soldiers who had once followed orders without question now saw clearly that ideology had brought only ruin. Many turned in old comrades not out of betrayal, but out of a grim pragmatism. Peace was the only ideology left that mattered. Denazification, the Allies' most sacred post-war mission, moved faster in the Canadian zones than anywhere else. Outsiders could interrogate, threaten, and classify people for years without ever getting the full truth. But when Germans themselves were given supervised responsibility, the truth surfaced quickly. They knew who had been fanatical party members, who had profited from Aryanization, who had simply kept their heads down to survive. And in most cases, they protected the quiet survivors while exposing the dangerous ideologues. Intelligence officers attached to the Canadian headquarters noticed the change immediately. Reports that once took weeks of coercion now arrived in casual conversations over weak coffee. A former factory manager mentioned offhand that his old supervisor had been boasting about joining a secret network. A schoolteacher quietly passed a note listing names of boys who had been Hitler youth leaders and were now whispering about revenge. The information was precise, verifiable, and, crucially, voluntary. Trust, it turned out, was producing better intelligence than fear ever had. The system wasn't blind to its own risks. Every appointment was still vetted. Every meeting monitored. Canadian veto power remained absolute. But the balance had shifted. Instead of Canadians trying to control everything, they were controlling the framework while Germans filled in the details. And the Germans filled them in with surprising efficiency, because the alternative was starvation, disease, and anarchy. By November 1945, the first classified assessments began circulating in London, Washington, and Ottawa. Staff officers compared occupation statistics across zones. Canadian sector, lowest per capita troop requirement, lowest incident rate per thousand civilians, fastest return of basic services, water, power, sanitation, highest reported civilian satisfaction in anonymous surveys, conducted carefully through neutral channels, fewest reported cases of black market violence or organized resistance. One British Major General wrote in a private memo, "The Canadians appear to have discovered that treating defeated enemies as human beings capable of redemption yields better results than treating them as perpetual criminals. It is politically uncomfortable, but militarily undeniable." Yet the discomfort was real. In Washington, military government officials still viewed the approach with deep suspicion. Any concession to former enemies risks legitimizing the regime we just destroyed, one senior planner argued in a closed-door meeting. British politicians worried about public opinion back home. Families who had lost sons in the Blitz were not ready to hear about Germans being given authority, even supervised. The pressure reached Ottawa. Cables arrived asking for guarantees that no former SS or high-ranking Nazis were slipping through the net. Harper and his superiors prepared detailed dossiers showing every background check, every arrest, every case where the system had caught and removed threats. They emphasized one key statistic. In the Canadian zone, the number of confirmed werewolf-related incidents was 0. In comparable Allied sectors, it was in the dozens. Through it all, Lindenberg remained the quiet model. General Reinhard continued his work, now coordinating not just local services but training sessions for incoming Canadian officers from other sectors. He taught them the subtle signs of reliability: the man who looked you in the eye when he spoke, the official who worried more about feeding children than about saving face, the engineer who volunteered fixes without being asked. One evening in late November, as snow dusted the cleared streets, Harper watched Reinhard review blueprints for a new school building with a group of young German architects. The general's voice was as formal as ever, but there was something new in his posture, less rigid, almost at ease. After the meeting, as the others left, Reinhard lingered. Through the interpreter, he said quietly, "Captain, when you first spoke to me in that ruined hall, I believed you were either a fool or a very dangerous man. Now I see you are neither. You are simply someone who understands that defeat is not the end of responsibility." Harper didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded. Reinhard continued, "I will never be forgiven for the war I fought in. Nor should I be. But if I can help prevent the next one by showing that even enemies can build together, then perhaps some small part of what was broken can be mended." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't friendship. But it was the closest thing to partnership either man had expected in May. Outside, the first winter snow fell softly on a town that was no longer dying. Lights glowed in windows that had been dark for months. Children laughed in the streets. And somewhere in the quiet, the idea born in rubble was growing roots strong enough to outlast the politics, the suspicions, and the memories of war. The real question now wasn't whether the Canadian method would survive the occupation. It was whether the world would be brave enough to use it again, when the next war ended and the next peace began. By the spring of 1946, the Canadian method had quietly become the unofficial standard across the entire Canadian occupation zone. 4.5 million Germans lived under a system of supervised self-governance, towns and small cities running their own daily affairs through local officials, coordinated by trusted liaisons like Reinhard, all watched closely but never micromanaged by a skeleton force of Canadian troops. The zone had the lowest casualty figures, the fastest rebuilding pace, and, most remarkably, the least lingering bitterness of any Allied sector. Yet the true measure of success wasn't in the statistics. It was in the small, human moments that no report could fully capture. In Lindenberg's rebuilt Market Square, German families now bought bread from stalls run by neighbors who had once feared each other. Children chased each other past Canadian soldiers who no longer carried their rifles at the ready. An elderly couple who had lost their son on the Eastern Front shared coffee with a young private from Saskatchewan who spoke no German but smiled when they offered him a slice of cake baked with rationed flour. Words weren't needed. The gesture was enough. Captain Elias Harper watched these scenes from the steps of the town hall, now patched and painted. He was 29 years old and felt 40. He had received no medal, no promotion beyond what his service record already entitled him to. His personnel file simply noted satisfactory performance of duties. That was all. When the time came for his unit to rotate home in early 1946, he packed quietly. He left behind a town that was no longer dying, a place where lights stayed on, water ran clean, and people slept without listening for footsteps in the night. General Karl Reinhard remained until September 1945, then was transferred to a standard prisoner of war facility as the trial period formally ended. He underwent denazification proceedings like every other senior officer. The judges examined his record carefully, a career soldier who had commanded in a war of aggression, yet who had also protected a civilian widow, coordinated the feeding of thousands, and helped prevent the chaos that could have claimed far more lives. They classified him as a follower rather than an instigator. His sentence: time already served. He was released in 1947. Reinhard returned to civilian life as a civil engineer. He spent the next 16 years helping rebuild bridges, roads, and water systems across northern Germany, the same infrastructure he had once helped restore under Canadian supervision. He never spoke publicly about Lindenberg. He never sought recognition. He simply worked until his retirement in 1963, then lived quietly until his death in 1978. He and Harper never met again. Back in Saskatchewan, Harper resumed teaching history in the same one-room schoolhouse where he had begun. The prairie sky was as wide as ever, the wheat fields endless. He was quieter than before, but the children noticed he told stories differently now. He spoke less about battles and more about what happened afterward, how the hardest choices were often the ones made when the shooting stopped. For 32 years he taught. He retired in 1978 at the age of 61, still carrying the same quiet certainty that history wasn't just dates and treaties. It was people deciding, in the worst moments, whether to repeat the past or break the cycle. On his desk, through all those decades, sat a single photograph. It showed Lindenberg's town square in mid-June 1945. Canadian soldiers in rolled sleeves stood beside German workers hauling timber. A child waved from the edge of the frame. The sun was out. No one smiled for the camera, they were too tired, but there was something in their posture, shoulders relaxed, tools held loosely, the first hint that strangers could become something else. Students sometimes asked about the picture. Harper would look at it for a long moment, then say simply, "That's the day I learned the most important thing history never teaches clearly. Wars end with signatures on paper. But peace begins when people decide to treat each other as human again, even when everything says they shouldn't." The lessons from that small German town in May 1945 did not stay small. When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, American planners studied the Canadian occupation reports in detail. They saw how empowering local administration, under strict oversight, produced faster recovery, honest reporting, and self-policing against corruption. Billions of dollars flowed into Europe not as direct handouts, but through German institutions managed by German officials. The core principle was the same: give people tools, responsibility, and guarded trust, and they will rebuild better than any outsider ever could. West Germany's Basic Law of 1949 enshrined strong local governance. Towns and cities retained real power to run their own affairs, protected from over-centralization. No official document ever cited Lindenberg directly. But the echo was unmistakable. The pattern repeated elsewhere. In Japan, American occupiers worked through existing institutions rather than dismantling them entirely. In Korea, local administration remained Korean under guidance. Decades later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the same quiet principle resurfaced in Eastern Europe. Empower rather than impose, trust rather than control, work with people rather than against them. The most powerful weapon against post-war collapse, it turned out, was never overwhelming force. It was the willingness, risky, politically uncomfortable, often career-threatening, to see former enemies not as perpetual threats, but as people who, given the chance, might help build the very peace they had once fought to destroy. In the end, Captain Elias Harper did not change the world alone. He simply proved, in one shattered town, that another way was possible. And once shown, that way refused to be forgotten. Years after his retirement, when former students returned to visit the old teacher, they sometimes found him sitting on his porch, looking out at the prairie. If they asked about the war, he would smile faintly and say the same thing every time. Peace isn't the absence of fighting. It's the presence of choices, hard ones, that make tomorrow better than yesterday. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between history's great battles, that simple truth still holds. The end.